Hi, everybody, and welcome. We're just going to give it another minute while more people join us, and then we will get started. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us for Dr. Mélanie Méthot's professorial lecture tonight, Lessons on Subjectivity, the Sad Story of Bigamist Julie Russell. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the land on which we gather, traditionally known as Asiniskau Sepesis or Stony Creek, is Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. The land on which the Augustana campus of the University of Alberta is located provided a traveling route and home to the Maskwacis, Nahiawak, Niitsitapi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations, the Métis and other Indigenous peoples. Their spiritual and practical relationships to the land create a rich heritage for our learning and life as a community. I'm Dr. Shauna Wilton. I am the chair of the Department of Social Sciences and an associate professor of political studies. And I have been Melanie's colleague since she was on the hiring committee that hired me 18 years ago this year. So I'm very excited to be here tonight to introduce her and to help moderate the discussion. So Dr. Méthot is now a professor of social sciences at the Augustana campus. She is an award-winning teacher and an internationally recognized expert on the historical study of bigamy. She has published many articles and book chapters. Recently, she co-edited a book, Canada's Legal Past, Looking Forward, Looking Back. And she was also, a couple of years ago, the Australian Griffiths Criminology Institute's visiting scholar. She had a fellowship to do research there on bigamy in Australia. Over her career, she has held 2 major Shirk scholarships or fellowships, one to study bigamy in Canada, and most recently, one to study bigamy in Australia. So I'd like to turn it over to Mélanie now and let her share the story of her research with you.
Hi, here we are on Zoom. Some of you will be happy that thank you actually, Shauna, I should have said that first. So some of you will be happy that you did not have to leave the comfort of your home. Others are less happy because maybe you have no good reason to give for not being here. While another segment is grateful to the pandemic. Yes, I said grateful to the pandemic. Without COVID-19, we might never have discovered the advantages of Zoom meetings. Some of my sisters and brothers from out east are able to attend their baby sister's lecture thanks to the pandemic. Thank you to alumni, friends, students, and colleagues for being here tonight. A special thank to my own children. I love you so much. And thank you to my husband, Mark, who sacrificed so much so, like he says, I could have my cake and eat it too. Right now, I'm imagining everyone I know in the room. Thank you to all of you who stopped by my office today or stopped me in the corridor, wrote on Facebook, or phoned me to let me know that you would be joining tonight. For those of you who know me well, you are aware that a Zoom meeting was not my preference. Hell, I postponed last year's lecture because they asked me to pre-record it, something I couldn't imagine doing. So if it's not yet apparent to you, I'm much more of an extrovert than an introvert. And I get energized when I'm in contact with others. So again, thank you for being here. At Augustana, we must indicate if we want to be promoted on teaching or on research. I'm still excited about my research, but I believe my biggest impact is in the classroom. So for tonight's event, I thought I would give you a taste of my teaching approach by presenting my research in a similar way that I interact with students in the classroom. So I want to say you can interrupt me at any time. Use this chat function. It's supposed to be on. Like if you want right now, you can say hi, and I know it's working. I remember a few years ago, I was giving a talk at Augustana, and as I was discussing an aspect of my research, Dean Berger butted in. He interrupted me, and it felt great because it showed that he was so interested that he could not wait to ask his question. Oh yes, the chat works, thank you. So his spontaneous intervention proved that I was having a conversation with the audience rather than me simply talking at them. The next slide is not, oops, yes, that slide, yes, is not such a flattering picture of me, but I wanted to provide proof that I welcome questions. The background shows that I have a slide on. So the presentation was not over. I was giving a talk at the Genealogical Society here in Edmonton. So it shows that, and if you can tell about the expression on my face, I'm in conversation with a member of the audience. So the talk is not over, and I'm talking with an audience member. So I'm going to try to monitor the chat at the same time. Somebody's calling, oh, bonsoir in French, that's my sister. Good. This being said, I also chose a picture because it was taken by my daughter. So I want to give credit to Marie-Eve, my youngest child, who knows a lot about bigamy for such a young person. So in my classroom, I like to learn the names of all my students very quickly because it encourages conversation. I want to give everyone the occasion to share their thoughts and insight. So I do call them by name to answer a question, even if they do not volunteer. I never want to put anyone on the spot, although I did today. So I do tell them that if they do not want to answer, they can use humor and say the name of another student who is dying to answer the question that I was asking. I was hoping to use that tactic tonight, but the webinar feature will not allow me to do that. So for all of you introverts in the room, you should take technology for its limits. Before I go to the next slide, remember that you can use the chat function to ask a question. I will do my best to monitor them. So when I look down, it's because I'm looking at the chat. And if at the end I have not answered some question, Dr. Wilton will let me know during the question period. Okay, now you have the rules of the game. So let me introduce you to the plan for the rest of the evening. I will give you a brief overview of my research project. We will look together at tonight's announcement, the blurb that was put on the web. And I'm hoping for some interaction at that moment. Again, use the chat function. Then I will be discussing the monograph I wrote. And I've asked Dr. Wilton to intervene if I'm going over time, because sometimes I tend to go over time, especially when I'm excited. And you can tell by how fast I'm speaking right now that I'm quite excited. And we're going to end the evening with questions and comments. So on my next slide, I want to tell you how I came to the topic. Accidentally. Yes, I came to the topic by accident. I was reading turn of the century newspapers on microfilms. That was way back then, while I was doing my PhD on social reformers. And I saw 2 cases of bigamy in 1 year. I thought, wow, there's something there. So I did actually receive, as Dr. Wilton mentioned, I did receive a Shirk grant way back for my work on bigamy in Canada. And I assure you that when I wrote the grant application to justify why they should fund me to research bigamy in Canada, I had to see something else than my unhealthy interest in anything to do with marriage and romance. At the time, the Canadian government was considering expanding the definition of marriage to include some same-sex couples. So it seemed perfect timing to study how Canadians understood marriage. What are the functions marriage play in society? So as you see on the slide, I look at the extraordinary, which are bigamy cases, to get to the ordinary. How did the courts, governments, society, and the individual understand marriage? So, fingers to your chat button. Let me ask now about the image I have chosen to depict bigamy. What does this image say to you? What does it tell you about bigamy? I'm looking at the chat button now. I'm looking at the chat. What do you see and what does it say to you? Aha! Yes, indeed. It was primarily men who committed bigamy, wasn't it? Why is one showing a man leading a double life? Ooh, like that too. It's always the guys. People think it involves one many, multiple women. Indeed, that's what you're seeing right now. We do see the way that this law firm decided to depict bigamy is one man with two women. So contrary to the popular depiction, such as this one, both men and women commit bigamy. The law does not make any distinction between gender. It is true that in all the jurisdictions I have studied, the court prosecuted men, many more men than women. Let's take a step back and define how the Canadian law defined bigamy. There's three ways to commit bigamy. The first one is to marry someone when you're already married. The second one is to marry someone you know is already married. You don't even have to be married. You just have to know that you want to go and marry this person who's already married. And the third way in the Canadian text, this is not something you see in other jurisdictions, and it is to prevent polygamy, is the fact that you're not allowed to marry two people at the same time during the same ceremony. So those are the ways to commit bigamy according to the Canadian context. I find it really interesting that for the second one, the fact that if you marry someone that you already married, it's in Alberta jurisdiction, especially in Northern Alberta, that we see the most of these people who are being prosecuted for marrying someone that they already married, that they know is already married. And it also is interesting that it's only men who have been charged via the second way. And what does it say? It says the fact that it's men that is being charged with knowing that they're marrying somebody who's already married. It says that a woman would never do this because she would risk illegitimacy. But men couldn't be conned. They knew. So women were often conned into a bigamist relationship while men knew what they were doing. So let me go to my next slide, which I want to tell you a few of my findings, this general stuff. So as you can read, what I've found so far with my bigamy cases is that the court prosecuted men more often. Usually 75% of the cases were men, although in Alberta, women counted for 33%. Female bigamists received lighter sentences. The press and the courts tended to paint women as victims. There's very few instances of double life. And here somebody mentioned double life in the comments. A double lifer would be somebody like what we see in the popular depiction, be it in those TV shows when you have a truck driver who has one wife in California and the other one in Florida and have these kind of a relationship. We don't tend to see in those stories a woman who has two husbands, because it's pretty hard to hide pregnancies. But there's very few instances, the court did not prosecute those kind of bigamists. Most of the time, the marriage was over, though not officially. That's what those are the people who are being prosecuted in the court. And finally, in the mind of jurists and in the press discourse, marriage served many functions, but the principal one was to protect women and children, or if you want to put it differently, it was also to keep women in their right place in the home. So next slide, what about Julie? I first encountered her on the pages of the Quebec Prison Ledger. I found her name twice. She was in and out on November 13, 1879, and then she spent a night in a cell before her April 1880 trial. You read, or perhaps you didn't read it, the blurb for tonight. So let me go back over it, as it is primordial to illustrate the point I want to make tonight. I presented a few facts and a few protagonists to you. In the blurb, it says that Julie married in 1855 Édouard Robitaille. In 1877, Julie, a widow, married an older widower, William Russell, in the same church where she had married her first husband. In 1878, William made a new will in which he left everything to his, and it's a quote, beloved wife, Julie. 6 weeks later, 6 weeks after he wrote that will, Julie sent her husband to the loony bin. Missing since 1865, Édouard Robitaille, the first husband, knocked at her door 8 months later. With 2 husbands alive, Julie faced a bigamy trial. This is all stuff you read in the blurb. If you haven't read it, now I'm telling you about it. A few months later, William died, and his niece, Ellen Russell, with whom he had been living since he came out of the asylum, contested the will. I also mentioned that the case was first tried in Quebec Superior Court, then appealed in the Court of Revision, so the appeal court, and again at the Supreme Court of Canada. That was the blurb. I did on purpose to put those information in. So now, and I'm going to start reading, that's what I'm looking down because I'm looking at the chat. I want to know what are your first impressions? Who do you sympathize with? Who is it who's guilty or not guilty? Who, if somebody is guilty? So who do you think, like we're talking about a will contestation, who should inherit the money or anything else? I know it takes time to type, so I'm going to wait a few seconds to see what you think. Okay, I like some of the comments here are really good. Maybe they should share it, haha. I sympathize with the husband number 1, Édouard Robitaille. I sympathize with her husbands, and Denise should definitely get the money. What else I see? How did husband number 2 get out of the loony bin? Is it a matter of law rather than ethics? All this is wonderful. As a matter of fact, I'm asking because the kind of information we give will also make you think about who should we sympathize with or not, or as some has mentioned, who should get the money, just split it. I found it really interesting that my brother Bernard, who graciously read a few chapters, answered to my question the same way as some of you did. He sympathized with the poor old William. And I thought, wow, I never crossed my mind. Obviously, I didn't get lots of information right now, but from my title, you can tell I sympathize with Julie because I call it, the title is The Sad Story of Julie Russell. So why is it that I sympathize with Julie? How is it that I had those feelings towards her. When we read about court cases, we instinctively side with one of the parties. I could name a few highly mediatized cases of the past few years. Do the experiment. I'm going to say those names and think if you feel there's somebody guilty and somebody who was unfairly treated or anything like this. So I'm just going to say the name and you can think. Gian Comanche, Colton Bushy, Robert Latimer. Instantly, we identify or sympathize either with the victim or sometimes with the offender. After all, the court has the duty to take side. So tonight, I could simply tell you the story of Julie the Bigamist, which is in itself fascinating. But instead, I want to bring you on my research journey and illustrate how I had to face my own subjectivity. I'm trained to identify biases in others, not necessarily to constantly check my own. So I'm using my own experiment with Julie's judicial saga to show that it is very difficult to change from a first impression. On my next slide, I want to say that I first told you that I encountered Julie first through the pages of a prison ledger. There was also a very slim case file at the archives. We don't like slim case files because there's not much inside of them. We like them thick, fat. But those case files gave me some dates so I could check into newspapers' account because remember, this is way before digitalization. So I had to go into microfilms. So I had to do punctual research. And the first article I came by is the one that you have in front of you. And from that article, I really fell for the poor Julie. And I was also able to find more articles, enough to be able to reconstruct the bigamy case. And I wrote an article about it, talking, about having all these, just those prison record, the little case file, and all those newspaper articles. I was able to reconstruct the bigamy trial. And just at the moment where I was about to submit it to an academic journal, I decided to Google Julie's name. Next slide. So I put Julie Morin, which is her maiden name, bigamy in 1879. Lo and behold, I came across a judicial decision. I could not believe my eyes. There was something more that I could look at. So on my next slide, the journey started with a mention in the prison registry. That was back in 2008, which brought me to a case file, very thin, with the dates I was able to find, because there's a big gap between 2008 and 2012, because at that moment I was not writing only about Julie, I was writing about bigamy in Canada. But then when I found tried to find newspapers articles about all the bigamists I found more on Julie. And at that moment, my interpretation was, when I wrote this first article, was after 13 years of marriage, which did not yield any children, the couple, Édouard and Julie, mutually decided to separate. In 19th century Quebec, you have to know that divorce was not an option. So that was my interpretation. But thanks to Google, now I had law reports. If the bigamy case did not leave any legal documents or substantial, the will contestation produced a mountain of them. I read with great interest the opinions of not only the Superior Court judge, who had decided if William was crazy when he willed all his assets to Julie, but also had the opinions of the 3 judges from the Quebec Court of Revision and from 5 judges from the newly created Supreme Court of Canada. So I'm doing all this. And then again, I decide to Google. Google is so nice. And I found one monograph by Jean Simon, who happens to be the great-grandson of Judge Ulrich Tessier, who was one of the judges at the appeal court. Next slide. And this is where I told you I sympathize with Julie. I mean, I'm not telling you all the details of why I sympathize with Julie Morin, or Julie Rossel, as I call her now. But I was just so surprised reading the account by Simon, because he had a totally different interpretation than me. I thought mine was better because I was not a mere urbanist. No, joke aside, my interpretation had to be better because I had much more information than the great-grandson of the judge. All he had was the published judgment. The stuff that I found with the, it's all right, Shauna, you can leave it there. The stuff that I had found through the Google first, the judgment, the opinion of the judges, this is what Simon was reading. And one of the judge, French-Canadian Taschereau, sided against Julie and with Ellen Denise, because as the interpretation, the facts that I gave you in the blurb are those that Taschereau highlighted. So here I am, I'm reading Simon's interpretation of the case, and he really sided with Ellen Denise and against Julie. He really believed that she was guilty, that actually she had, what's the word? I cannot think about it. Give me a second. She had connived with Édouard Robitaille, who happened to arrive on her doorstep 8 months later to get to the money of the poor old William. And Simon, the academic, kept saying, she had no proof that her husband was dead when she married William Russell. But that's false. It was proven in the bigamy trial that she had a letter which said that her husband was dead. Everybody had received a letter. When I mean everybody, even the father of the first husband received a letter saying that his son was dead. So she was not a bigamist. She was a widow when she married William Russell. She certainly had no bad intention. At least that was my interpretation. That certainly was not the interpretation of Simon. So I forged ahead, and I wrote a chapter on the opinion of the judges. With the help of the very nice Excel sheet, I took note of all the witnesses the judges refer to in their own decision. Why did they quote one witness and forget about others? What is it that made them think that these particular witnesses were better than the others? I had no clue at that moment. I'm just reading all this, checking who they are referring to. And it is with great excitement that I discovered through the judge decision that Julie, yes, thank you, Catherine. The letter could have been written by husband number one in cahoots with the wife to deceive them all. Yeah, and I thought that, as a matter of fact, at first, when I read the newspaper's account just for the bigamy case, the bigamy trial, I thought it's possible the letters, like they had decided together. My interpretation changed from that first time around when I thought that they might have been deceiving authorities, and deceiving not because the letter was received really early on. It was not received, during the bigamy trial. It was received before she married again in 1877. She received it in 1872, the letter. So thank you, Catherine. That was really good. So that was my interpretation at first. But once I got more documents, and as I said, through the judge's decision, the opinion that they wrote, I found out that Julie was involved in other legal proceedings, which means more documents. So I ordered those documents, and it does take time for the archives to digitize everything and whatever. But I had, from the reference that the judges made in the opinion, I found 3 other legal cases. And here, Catherine, that answers your question. There was one, or your comments. There was one case about assault and battery. So Julie had been assaulted by her first husband. She did go in I don't remember exactly now, I think 1864, before he disappeared. She accused him of assault and battery. There was also a separation of bed and board that came in 1980. And there's also another case of the pilot corporation, because William was a pilot. And according to their bylaws, Julie was allowed to receive a widow pension. But the pilot corporation argued that Julie was not William's wife, so she should not receive the money. But it doesn't matter what they find out or whatever, it's that all these documents gave me more insight into what was happening. And it did show that I had a wrong view at first, with only thinking that both Julie and Édouard wanted out of that marriage. That was a wrong way to think about other stuff. So the 3 legal case file, and I want to say that I wrote the chapter as I discovered the sources. As I said, because of the reference in the opinions, the judge's opinion, I was able to find out that paradise for the historian, there was 1,000 pages of manuscript document about the will contestation. So I've ordered them and I received them in July 2016. Among all these things, there were 72 witnesses who paraded before the judges to tell their story about if they believe if William was crazy or not, or if Julie was guilty or not of bigamy. She had already been judged in 1880 and found innocent. But this will contestation was a second trial of bigamy, a bit like a O.J. Simpson, I'm thinking. He had the criminal trial where he got off, but then there was a civil trial where he could again be tried. So I said that 1,000 pages of manuscript document. Then I also started looking at marriage contracts, because in the judge's opinion, they also mentioned those, and they also mentioned them in these 1,000 pages, because there were so many documents. So I have marriage contracts, wills, procuration, look at the census, and that was all done in the fall 2016. Then, yay! Because the case went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, I got typed documents of the case. So in the Supreme Court of Canada, they are the same documents that were presented during the appeal court, although they add a few more things, but now they were typed. So for whatever thing that I didn't read properly, I had the stuff typed. That was wonderful. So I received those in December 2016, and all along I'm writing stuff. And then I got a sabbatical in 2019, and because I was on ancestry.ca, I was able to find notarial acts. All the acts that William Russell, the pilot, what's the term? Engaged with. So there was 150 or more actually acts that he went and consulted notaries. So that gave me a much bigger portrait of the dead person, of William, of the poor husband, as some of you have been sympathizing with him. And that was in the fall 2019. And I also look at city directories to see where my bigamist was living. And then I got I submitted actually my monograph, which I wrote, as I said, according to the discovery of sources. The point was that there was a teacher in me which thought that I should demonstrate with concrete evidence how my own interpretation changed, maybe we can say evolve, as I discovered new sources. The practical Mélanie thought, might as well do something with the fact that it was taking so long for me to write the monograph. Let's do something original about it. So I want to say that I want to specify that when I say that my interpretation changed, is mostly that my interrogation or what I was looking at was different. Instead of thinking always about who is bad and who is good, who should win, should it be the wife or the niece that is inheriting the money because he had money, William, if you didn't get it by now, he had money. After reading all those testimonies and other documents which were presented at the Superior Court, I decided to forget about who deserved more sympathy. Instead, I used the info included to take a snapshot of life in Quebec City. In another chapter, I analyzed the strategies legal counsels use. So I was less interested in saying that Julie was innocent or was much better than how they portrayed her, and thinking what those documents can tell us about Quebec society. What does it tell us about how judges or individuals saw marriage or family relation? So this is how I wrote the monograph, which I submitted to McGill Queen's Press in January 2021. Last May, I received the comments from the reviewers. Both recommended publication, but one with substantial revisions. So on my next slide, I decided to share with you some of the comments I received from the less positive review, but so useful. And he or she was not convinced by the structure. Who writes a book according to the discovery of sources? So here I'm going to read, I say that to my student all the time, don't read your slide, but I put on purpose the whole quote there and I'm going to read it with you. I must admit, it's a quote obviously from the critique, I must admit, I found this a strange rationale for a chapter structure. It might make sense if the uncovering of new sources that changed the story was a central part of its exposition. It is not. Certainly the evidence given in later trial explain aspects of each individual's history, but they don't transform the history. You can imagine, you may have noticed that on a previous slide, how excited I got a day before I sent my reply to the comments to the editor. So here, you receive those critiques and then you have to write something to the editor about the reviewer's comments. And just one day before I had to send my reply, I found 3 new legal documents. Thanks to the ever-growing digitalization of archival documents, I was able to go into the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec, which is the Quebec archives, and I was just checking, is it possible there's still stuff out there? And then I found those 3 new documents. So I ordered them and I could not wait to see what they contain. So, because here's the critique is saying, look, how is that changing the story with these documents? But now I had new one. On the next slide, I have another criticism. The reviewer wrote, because of the structures, readers only learn details about situation or people in those chapters dealing with the evidence they give at a particular trial. For example, I would suggest setting out much more clearly early on how long Hélène was living with William and Helen, and the work she contributed to their household. We may not sympathize with her, as the author clearly does not, but we might understand how the caring work she did legitimized her anger. Méthot's way of usually referring to her as William's niece rather than his adopted daughter is a repeated reminder of the author's version of the history, as are her more frequent naming of William Russell as Ellen's uncle rather than her adoptive father. I found that comment particularly revealing. See, this is when my student will all say all together how to say that word. So I found the comment revealing. In all the documents I came across, never did Ellen, her uncle William, or any other witnesses refer to her as his daughter. But the reviewer would like me to do so. The reviewer would like me to say that, hey, she was William's adoptive daughter. But never did she say so herself. I prefer to let the evidence speak for itself. But bear with me a few more minutes. I'm sharing the constructive criticism because unsuspectingly, the reviewer gave credence to my own process. Here to the next slide. The author consistently downplays the significance of the domestic labor and caring work that the women provide and that William seeks to reward. A man like him, with his drinking and his illnesses and absences while away piloting, needed someone to keep house and to care for him. We don't learn much about the caring work that Ellen provided, for example, until around page 110. It might help readers understand some of the roots of her resentment, rather than thinking she is a bad, conniving person, which seems to be Méthot's argument. She is not a sympathetic character, but her motives and emotion deserve more nuanced exploration. Her understandable sympathy for Morin blinds her to some of the way her sympathy is me. My sympathy for Julie blinds her to some of the ways Ellen was rightly resentful that all the work she did for William and Ellen, which is the wife of William, when they were aging and dying, was no longer going to be repaid by his final provision. Yeah, so you can tell probably that this author likes Ellen, the niece, or Ellen, the daughter, as he or she would like me to say. On the next slide, you see, I see the critique proving my point. In the review, the critique said, I should note that I read much of this while helping a family member undergoing chemotherapy. So the diverse interruption may have contributed to me losing the plot in places, but I hope they are helpful. Yes, all the critique that I received were very helpful. But from the quotation I share with you tonight, you will probably agree with me that the reviewer seems to have sympathized with Ellen, who took care of her uncle and her aunt who died. And you know with this last quote that maybe the reviewer was sympathizing with Ellen because the reviewer was taking care of somebody sick. Not only authors are subjective, so are readers. Sometimes we fail to put aside our own bias when we read the newspapers or listen to the news. My monograph tells the fascinating story of Julie Russell, but it also reflects on who I am, a teacher. I wanted to demonstrate how subjectivity creeps in despite the historian desire to remain objective. The discovery of new sources led me to new questions. It forced me to look differently at the evidence that I had gathered. In this chapter where I analyzed the 72 testimonies of witnesses, rather than using the evidence to decide whom to side with, I used the information to draw a portrait of the protagonist and of the lawyers who pled the case. My aim tonight was to try to reproduce what happens in my classroom, to give you a small glimpse of my research, perhaps pique your interest enough so that you want to read the monograph, if it ever comes out. But above all, I wanted to remind you to check your own biases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. That was really enjoyable and interesting, even if I have heard you talking about the case in the book for a number of years now. So some applause from the audience in the chat. And now we are going to open it up for questions. You can put them in the chat, or you can use the question and answer, the Q&A box, preferably, to put any questions in that you have for Melanie, or any comments you have about her talk, the case, or the sad story of Julie. We did have one question come in advance, so I'll maybe start with that one while everybody else thinks of their questions. And that question was asking, is true objectivity even possible? Given that we're all being observed, we're all subject to observation of ourselves and others, how can you ever leave all of your biases behind? I guess I would add to the end of that question.
That's a wonderful question. And I guess the talk is answering your question. I'm showing, and that was my point in the monograph, is to show that we are subjective. And actually, we cannot be totally objective. And the point is not to be all bad about it. Poor you, you're subjective, bad, bad, bad. It's about to be aware of your own biases, to see when they creep up on you, you know, to make sure that you acknowledge them. I know why I feel this way towards Julie. Sure, I mean, there's a lot of evidence, which I didn't tell you about. You can ask me later, or, you know, read the book. It's in French, but still, it's going to be translated. It's going to be so good. But yeah, that's my point. We are subjective, no matter what. Even the reviewer, I hope have shown, was quite subjective. Why does this person want me to call the niece the adopted daughter? She was not. She didn't even call herself as such. She always called her my uncle, my uncle, my uncle. But me, I'm supposed to go and say, oh, you adopted father. So here you go. So thank you for the question. That's the whole point of the talk. We're subjective, live with it.
I think they're going to turn off the chat so if people can just use the Q&A now. So I'm going to use one follow-up question from Kimberly Clark, because it sort of touches on the one that you were just answering. And Kimberly asks, did you ever worry that your perspective would change after reading the criticisms given to you? Were you more willing to conform to other ideas, or were you very set in how you had interpreted the history?
It's a beautiful question. Thank you, Kimberly. Kim, I'm not afraid. I can change opinion. I can change interpretation. Let the data speak. And as a matter of fact, I did mention, you know, I don't want you to all look down on the critique. You know, yes, I showed that the critique is subjective, but I want to say that there were very good criticism, which made me think differently about some of the stuff. And yes, I will add much more about how women took care. I didn't of other people. I didn't develop that aspect as much. Actually, not enough for sure. And so I'm happy to hear what other people say and what they think, because that's informed my own interpretation more than anything else.
And Catherine Bishop is adding on to this as well. She says, because you're so close to the story, you know all of its ins and outs. So I wonder if part of the critique of structure was actually about the clarity of the narrative. And she says she just had something similar happen to her. So in other words, you have to tell people what happened so they can judge. And another thought with the labeling of the adopted daughter, easily solved, explain why you call her the niece.
And yeah, that's easy, this one for the critique. But thanks, Kat. It's indeed, you know, but this, you know, with a structure like this, which I really tried not, I would write in the footnotes, you know, if I got new information, because a chapter, you know, somewhere, right, one was written back in 2012. But I left it as such. I added a few details that I got later on, which would not change the interpretation, but just give a bit more around it. But the point of the right, and I mean, this is what I wrote to the review, to the editor. I'm not ready to change the structure. I like it. I find it's totally different. It's original. It might be not what people want, certainly not what professors want, but it's the teacher. This is a pedagogical, I don't know what to put the stress. It's a teaching material somehow. I'm not trying to convince my peers necessarily about all these things, although I do have lots of new information and new ways of looking at marriage. But there's a bit of repetition and the story is there, but it does change, you know, like the point that I'm no longer interested, say in chapter 4 about is Julie good or bad, or is Ellen that really manipulating mean niece? It's no longer the point. It's like, no, now look, hey, I do mention that Ellen has a right. She thinks she certainly has a right to the money because she works so hard. That's on page 111, according to the reviewer. But yeah, that's the point. I wanted to show it came much later. First, I was too subjective because I had read that newspaper article which says that Julie was a saint. She walked bare feet all the way to Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré in the winter. That's a very pious woman. So yeah.
So Brian Rempel comes at you with a question from his more scientific mind, I guess, which was, how did the court ultimately rule? Sorry, Mélanie.
You notice that there's a lot of stuff I didn't say. And actually, so I'll tell you that the bigamy, I told you at that trial that she was found innocent. She didn't have, I mean, all the judges, the judge found her innocent because it was clearly that she didn't try to deceive anyone. And he believed in the letter as well. In the first will contestation, which was done right away after her uncle died, is the niece, Ellen, but actually it's not herself. She goes by through her sister, so she can testify. And in the first will contestation at the Superior Court in Quebec, they ruled in favor of Julie. So Ellen, take it to the appeal court. Again, they will rule for Julie. Not satisfied, she takes it all the way to the Supreme Court, who just happened to be 2 years in existence. So now the last chapter is about the right of the Supreme Court of Canada to judge something in Quebec, which has a different civil law. And the Supreme Court judge, it's a split jury, but the French-Canadian interpretation of Judge Taschereau win, and they decide to go with Hélène Denise. Then the counsel from Julie decided to try to bring it all the way to the Privy Council because, you know, we still have one last thing to go. And they decided not to let it go. And at first, before I saw all the documents, what I thought is that just the way it can be in inheritance proceeding is that there were no more money. So there was no point going. All the money had been spent to the lawyers, but it just didn't go ahead. So she won, Denise won.
Joanne asks, do you think that Julie's case would have been handled any differently if it was handled now or 10 years ago?
For sure. And the reason is that for the French judge, the Quebec judge, it was their conception of marriage. The fact that it was not possible in a Catholic society for a marriage to be over if the spouse was not dead. So they kept saying that even she had no intention, but she was married. She was the wife of Robitaille, and Robitaille could get all the money from William. That's why she went for a separation of bed and board. She had to say no, because her legal husband would have had all the money, which wasn't that much, from the second husband. So yes, he would have judged totally differently, because people would, the society in Quebec have changed a lot, much less religious, and they would accept that she was no longer married.
Okay, so a question from our dean, Demetrius, says, thank you for your wonderful talk. And what is the historian's, as opposed to, let's say, the novelist's responsibility? Is it to record the events or to make sense of them and produce meaning?
Thank you, Demetrius. That's a wonderful question. My students will know that I'm much about explaining the past and not taking side, although I was taking side, but I proved throughout the monograph how conniving Ellen was. So I am exposing what happened with proof. I don't take much liberty, like the novelist could, and romanticize the story. This being said, it's possible there's a movie. I want my cousin to do a movie on this thing. Who knows? I might be able to convince him. But and then he can romanticize about it. But I feel that the role of the historian is to explain the past, not necessarily to be an activist and say, okay, what should happen and whatever. So with all the evidence you have, and then I like to say that we let the data speak. I present the data. I didn't put anything aside. I presented everything, but I'm still subjective, because sometimes I felt, ooh, that Ellen, how can she do this? She's the one who went to get the first husband back in the States. She's the one who said, you come. He had no desire to be there. Probably he thought he was going to be pursued for the assaulted battery. They had to, make him drunk for him to come. Otherwise, he would not have come. And there's lots of back deal stuff happening. She paid money to get him, not him, but the person to go and get him. Does that answer the question? Thanks.
Stephanie Grilke, a former student of ours, asks, she says, I'm sure I know the answer to this, but were all the magistrates or judges male, both in the original cases and in the appeals? And also, when you talked about the second type of bigamy, you said it was understood that women wouldn't marry someone they knew was married for fear of illegitimacy, whereas a man would know. Is this a social legal assumption, or are there sources that show this is actually the case?
Okay,
it's always nice to see you trained your students well, Melanie.
The first question, indeed, at that time, there's no women judges. Actually, the first police magistrate, which happened to be a type of a judge or a juvenile judge, are in 1915 in Alberta, or in the old British Empire. Other of my work I've published, and she's asking because she worked on that, police magistrate Emily Murphy. So that's the first question. The second one, on about if male, the point is that no women were charged of bigamy for marrying somebody they already knew was married. And from that, there's an assumption that the judges or the prosecutors couldn't imagine that a woman would do this, because that would mean to put herself in a bad position, because if the first wife is legitimate, the second one is not. So who would want to do this to become illegitimate, and also to make your children would be illegitimate? So yes, it's an interpretation of the data. We don't say women are stupid, women can be conned and men cannot, but it's interpreting these facts into this, that they couldn't believe that a woman would do such a thing.
So your interpretation of the facts in that sense is revealing the legal and social assumptions that existed at the time.
Yes, thank you. And it's still subjective because it's an interpretation.
Okay, I think we are out of time, Melanie. Thank you very much. That was very enjoyable. There's a lot of comments as well in the questions if you have a chance to look at them after. Thanking you for a very enjoyable and interesting talk. We all hope that the book gets published and translated to English so we can all read it. And before we go, I just have a couple of quick announcements. So first of all, we are having Orange Shirt Day, celebrating that tomorrow on the university campus, since we are closed for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on Thursday. Also tomorrow, there will be an Alumni Week signature event, the work of neighbors, reimagining Indigenous settler relations. And you can go to the website for details on this and other upcoming events and to register for them. Thank you again, Melanie, and thank you everyone for coming and participating. Have a good night.